Nietzsche said that when you stare long enough into the abyss stares back. But here's what he didn't say: some men wave at it. They don't just commit the act. They leave something behind. A single shoe. A chess piece. A folded note. Not by accident. Not out of panic. On purpose. And that one detail, the tiny, deliberate object, tells you everything about the darkest corners of the human psyche. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why serial killers leave signature items, not as a plot device from a Netflix show, but as a psychological compulsion rooted in identity, power, and something Carl Jung called the shadow. You'll walk away with a framework that explains not just killers, but any human being who acts in secret and still desperately needs to be seen. This isn't just true crime trivia. Understanding this pattern changes how you read people: the colleague who undermines you anonymously but always leaves a trace, the person who ghosts you but checks your story every single day, the man who destroys something and then can't stop circling back to the wreckage. The psychology is the same. The scale is different. If you've ever wondered why people sabotage themselves right at the moment of getting away with something, this video is your answer. The signature and the method are two completely different things, and only one of them is about getting away with the crime. Dennis Rader, BTK, meaning bind, torture, kill, operated for over 30 years without being caught. He was methodical, disciplined, careful. But starting in 1974, he began sending letters to newspapers. Coded packages. Clues. He essentially handed investigators a roadmap to his psychology. In 2004, after a decade of silence, he came back. Not because he had to, because he needed to. He was a church president. A compliance officer. A man whose entire outer life was built on control and respectability. The killing was the MO. The letters were the signature. The MO got the job done. The signature served a completely different master. Criminologists draw a hard line between MO, the method, the logistics, the how, and signature, which is the psychological need being fulfilled beyond the crime itself. The MO can change. Killers adapt, get smarter, shift tactics. But the signature almost never changes, because it's not a choice, it's a compulsion. It's the part of the act that isn't about the victim at all. It's about the killer's internal world. The item left behind is a message. The question is, who is it addressed to? Jung's shadow explains why even the most controlled killer cannot stop himself from being seen. Carl Jung argued that every human being has a shadow, the sum of everything we've repressed, denied, or refused to acknowledge about ourselves. The more rigid and controlled the persona, the larger and more dangerous the shadow underneath. Edmund Kemper had a measured 145 IQ. He held conversations with FBI agents voluntarily about the psychology of serial killers, while actively being one. He was articulate, cooperative, almost charming. And yet he committed acts of extraordinary violence, then called the police himself to confess. He drove to a phone booth and turned himself in. Why? Because some part of him, the shadow, could not remain invisible. The persona had been too perfect for too long. The item left at the scene is the shadow's fingerprint. When a person builds their entire identity around control, competence, or invisibility, the shadow accumulates mass. It grows denser. And eventually it demands acknowledgement, not from the world necessarily, but from the self. Leaving an object is an unconscious act of self-disclosure. I was here. I did this. I exist. The irony Jung would have appreciated: the very act meant to prove power and control is driven by the most primal of human fears, the fear of being nobody. The Zodiac killer's ciphers weren't clues, they were a demand for recognition, and that need is more common than you think. The Zodiac killer terrorized Northern California in the late 1960s. He was never caught. But here's the thing: he didn't have to send anything. There was no tactical reason to mail ciphers to the San Francisco Chronicle. No operational reason to taunt the police. He did it because anonymity had become unbearable. His letters read like a man auditioning for an audience that didn't know he existed. I like killing people because it is so much fun, he wrote. Not because that was literally true, but because he needed a reaction. He needed to be the most interesting thing in the room, even if no one knew it was him. The cipher was a calling card from a man who had no other card to give. Psychologists call this narcissistic injury, the wound that forms when a person's internal sense of significance has no external validation. Nietzsche wrote about the will to power not as domination over others, but as self-overcoming, self-actualization. When that drive gets corrupted, when a person cannot build anything, cannot be seen for who they are, it inverts. Destruction becomes creation. The act of leaving something behind is the only way to say, my existence had weight. This is why the item is never random. A chess piece from a man who thinks of himself as strategically superior. A folded note from someone who craves intellectual recognition. The object chosen is always a self-portrait. Viktor Frankl's framework on meaning explains why the compulsion to leave a trace is, at its core, a survival mechanism gone catastrophically wrong. Frankl survived Auschwitz and wrote that the last of human freedoms is the ability to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. His central argument was that human beings can endure almost anything if they believe their existence has meaning. Now consider the inverse: a person who has built no meaning, contributed nothing, left no trace in any life they've touched, and who has lived for decades in that vacuum. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, confessed to 49 murders. In interviews, what struck detectives wasn't rage or sadism, it was emptiness. He described his life in flat, affectless terms. Work, routine, nothing. The murders were the only events he spoke about with any animation. They were his meaning. And the evidence he left, however small, was his proof that the meaning had been real. Frankl's insight was that meaning-making is not optional for human beings, it's a biological imperative as fundamental as hunger. When legitimate sources of meaning are absent or have collapsed, purpose, relationship, craft, contribution, the psyche will manufacture meaning from whatever material is available. For most people, this looks like obsessive work, or compulsive risk-taking, or self-destruction. At the extreme end of the spectrum, it looks like this. The object left at the scene is a monument. It says, something happened here that mattered. To no one else, but to me. The item is almost always connected to the killer's first experience of power, which is why profilers can use it to reconstruct an entire psychological history. John Douglas, one of the original FBI profilers and the real-world basis for the character in Mindhunter, documented that signature behaviors in violent offenders almost always trace back to a specific formative experience, usually an early moment where the person felt total control for the first time. The object left behind is a tether to that original moment. One offender Douglas profiled always left a single playing card, always the same card, at every scene. When Douglas finally interviewed him, the card connected to a specific childhood memory of domination, of the first time he felt that he had power over someone else. He wasn't leaving a clue. He was replaying the origin moment. Every time. Compulsively. This is what Camus called the myth made real, the absurd man who creates his own meaning through ritual repetition because the world has offered him none. The signature item is a ritual object. Its power comes not from what it is but from what it represents internally. This is also why profiling works. The item isn't random, it's a window into the specific shape of the wound. Investigators don't ask, what did he leave? They ask, what does this mean to him? And that question collapses decades of psychological history into a single object on a floor. Here's what you now know that most people don't. First, the signature and the method are completely separate. The method is tactical, the signature is psychological, and only the signature tells you who someone really is. Second, Jung's shadow explains the compulsion to be seen even in secrecy. The more controlled the surface, the more the hidden self demands acknowledgement, and the item left behind is the shadow's only voice. Third, Frankl's framework reveals that the need to leave a trace is a corrupted meaning-making impulse. When a person has no legitimate monuments to their existence, they will build illegitimate ones. The psychology here isn't alien. It's the darkest end of a spectrum every human being is somewhere on. The need to matter. The need to be seen. The need to leave something behind that says, I was here. If this hit different, if you found yourself thinking about people in your own life through this lens, subscribe. We drop one of these every Tuesday and Friday. No filler, no fluff. Just the psychology behind why people do what they do, pulled apart so you can actually use it. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next one.